In early 2014, married couple Derek and Maria Broaduss decided to move to Westfield, New Jersey, along with their three children. After much deliberation, Derek and Maria settled on a six-bedroom, four-bathroom Dutch colonial house located on 657 Boulevard. For Maria, this was a childhood dream come true because she was actually born and raised in Westfield. And in fact, Maria's childhood home was only a few blocks away from 657. As for Derek, he was excited to settle down somewhere with his family and begin a new chapter of his life. Unlike Maria, Derek was actually from Maine and was from a working class family. Eventually, Derek landed a job at an insurance company in Manhattan, where he would eventually climb the ladder and become the senior vice president of that company. Through this position and its salary, Derek could comfortably afford the $1.3 million price tag on 657 Boulevard. And as I said, this was supposed to be a new chapter for the Broadusses because just before the decision was made to purchase the house, Derek had just turned 40 years old. So, with the entire Broaduss family looking to the future, they purchased the house from the previous owners named John and Andrea Woods, and on June 2nd, 2014, they closed on the house. But over the next few days before the family would actually move in the home, Derek had hired some contractors to help with some last-minute renovations to the house. And on June 5th, 2014, after an evening of painting, Derek went to check the mailbox. Now, in the mailbox, there were stacks of bills and paperwork you would sort of expect to find after purchasing a home and, setting up all your new utilities in that home. However, in the stack of mail, something particularly caught Derek's eye. It was a small white envelope, and in large, thick handwriting, it was addressed to the new owner. Inside that envelope was a typed letter, which Derek pretty realistically assumed was from one of their new neighbors. And the letter did begin rather pleasantly. But before I begin reading, I want to explain that if there's any typos in the text I'm about to read, those typos were present in the original letters. So, with that in mind, the first letter begins with, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood." However, any sense of hospitality was quickly diminished in the next couple of paragraphs. The letter continues, 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. Then, horrifyingly, this unknown author begins making concerning and rather threatening remarks about the Broaduss' children. To close the letter, the author writes, "You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin. Signed, The Watcher." Immediately after finishing the letter, Derek ran back into the house, locked all the doors, shut off all the lights, and called the Westfield Police Department. When an officer arrived at the house and read the letter, he turned to Derek and aptly asked, "What the fuck After Derek explained that he had just found this letter in his mailbox, the officer asked Derek if he had any enemies in his personal or professional life. Derek was unable to think of anyone who would have any sort of vendetta against him, and since there was no return address on the letter, there was no way to accurately determine who this letter could have been from. So, all the officer could recommend is that Derek keep the house secure and call the authorities if anything else happens. That same night, Derek sped home to his wife and kids, who were still living at their old home in a separate part of Westfield, while waiting for renovations to be done on 657. With the kids already in bed, Derek shared the note with Maria, who was equally terrified. So, since police were unable to initiate any sort of investigation without more information, Derek and Maria decided to do some digging of their own. And that started with an email to John and Andrea Woods, who were 657's previous owners. In the email, the Broadusses shared the letter and asked if during the Woods' stay, they ever received any sort of letters. Shockingly, the following day, Andrea Woods responded to their email and said that she and her husband had received a letter in an envelope with no return address. That letter had came in about a week before they sold the house to the Broadusses. According to Andrea, the letter was short, and the author, who signed their name as The Watcher, thanked the Woods family for taking care of 657 Boulevard during their 24-year-long residency there. However, what was really in the note will never be known, because Andrea had thrown the letter away after reading it, because she and her husband mostly found the note strange, but not threatening. After reading the email, Maria contacted John and Andrea again and asked if they would accompany her to the police station to report the note again. Later that day, the three of them went to the Westfield Police Department and spoke to a detective about the letter. The detective, Leonard Lugo, told them all essentially the same thing the officer had told Derek. Keep the house secure and call if anything new came up. However, he also told them not to share the letter with anyone else, especially their neighbors, who could now all be potential suspects. For the next 2 weeks, Derek and Maria were on high alert. After the first letter, the couple decided to keep its contents hidden from their children so as to not, instill any sort of fear or, possibly traumatize them. So over those 2 weeks, Derek canceled a planned business trip, and whenever Maria visited the house with the kids, she always made sure to keep a close eye on what they were doing and where they were. And if one of them so happened to wander off too far, Maria would yell for them and order them to come back toward her. Sometime during this 2-week period, Derek found himself chatting with John Schmidt, who lived just a few houses down from them. Without mentioning the letters, Derek asked John about the people who live in the neighborhood, and after what John told him next, Derek was pretty positive about who wrote the letters. John told Derek that at 661 Boulevard, which was the house right next door to 657, lived a man named Michael Langford. Now, although Michael was well into his 60s, he still lived with his 90-something-year-old mother. In fact, all of his mother's children still lived in the house. John said that Michael didn't have a job, so he was mostly home all day and was, as John described, comparable to Boo Radley from To Kill a Mockingbird. As I said, Derek thought the case was solved. In the first letter, the Watcher mentioned that their father had watched the house in the 60s, and that time frame would almost perfectly match with Michael's age. With this information in mind, Derek went to Detective Lugo and told him that Michael Langford was most likely their man. But Detective Lugo told him that he was already well aware of Michael and the Langford family. Not only that, but just days prior, Lugo brought Michael to the station and questioned him about the letter. According to Lugo, Michael denied knowing anything about the letter, and besides finding Michael a little strange, Lugo said there was no evidence to link him to the letter, so they let him go. At first, Derek was furious about this because he was positive Michael was the Watcher. But even he realized that the evidence he had against Michael was very circumstantial. So, still no closer to discovering who the Watcher was, Derek went back home, and all the while, renovations continued to be done on 657 Boulevard. Then, on June 18th, 2014, the second letter arrived. This time, Maria found the letter in the mailbox after swinging by the house to just kind of look over some paint samples. When she saw the small white envelope, she immediately recognized the large, chunky lettering on it as the same style as the first letter. Without even opening it, Maria called the police. When they arrived, the police, Maria, and Derek went over the letter. And similar to the first letter, it began pleasantly before quickly turning hostile. It read, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. I am pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood you have brought to me. You certainly say their names often. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all of the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic, or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house." Then, in the second half of the letter, the Watcher gives some more information about their possible identity, but they also the Watcher seems to almost allude to the fact that the Woods family may somehow be involved in this act. The letter continues, "The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Broaduss family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know I will be watching. Signed, The Watcher." After this letter, Maria and Derek stopped bringing their children to the house altogether. Additionally, they decided to delay their move-in indefinitely. Understandably, by that point, Derek and Maria were very distraught and were scared of pretty much everyone. Maria would later say that no matter where she went, she was constantly on the lookout for anyone who seemed even slightly suspicious, and was hesitant to let their children ever leave the house. As for Derek, he sort of became obsessed with 657 Boulevard, and was determined to catch the Watcher in the act. Soon after the arrival of the second letter, Derek set up security cameras throughout the inside and outside of 657 Boulevard. Additionally, Derek would spend some nights in the home just crouched in a dark corner, just waiting to see if anyone ever approached the house. But no one ever did. Since Derek and Maria were now living in fear every day, and felt that the Westfield police were not taking this matter seriously, the pair decided to begin their own investigation. That started with them hiring a private investigator to stake out their neighborhood and run a background check on the Langford family. They did this because they did still have suspicions about Michael. Additionally, they reached out to a man named Robert Linehan, who was a retired FBI agent, to examine the letters more closely. And according to Linehan, the author of the notes was likely someone older. He pointed to the old-style typing and formatting found throughout both letters. Additionally, he believed that the author was likely a voracious reader, and doubted that the Watcher would act on any of their threats. But, due to the misspellings that were present throughout both of the letters, Linehan did admit that this showed some level of erraticism from the author. As for the private investigator, he was unable to pull up any sort of incriminating evidence against the Langford family. Nor was he able to discover anyone throughout the neighborhood who could have been the Watcher. But just as Linehan and the private investigator began winding down their investigations, a third letter arrived. This letter arrived at the home on July 18th, 2014, exactly 1 month after the second had arrived. At the beginning of the letter, the watcher simply asks, "Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing." This means the watcher had noticed that Derek and Maria, as well as their children, had stopped coming to the home and had yet to move in. And for the remainder of this letter, the watcher goes on their most unhinged and erratic rant thus far. So, the letter continues, 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass, and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Boulevard needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep in 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone. The house is crying from all the pain it is going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy, you are stealing its history. It cries for the past, and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The 1960s were a good time for 657 Boulevard when I ran from room to room, imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day he died. And now I watch and wait for the day when the young blood will be mine again. Signed, The Watcher. For Derek and Maria, this was the final straw, and they decided something had to be done. And even though their private investigator had failed to find anything incriminating, they decided to once again focus on the Langford family. This started with a letter they had written to the Langfords, where they falsely stated that they were planning to demolish 657 Boulevard. Now, this was done in collaboration with the Westfield police and was meant to try and force a response from the Watcher. But there was never a response. Next, Detective Lugo brought Michael in for another interview, but just like the first time, there was nothing to link Michael to the crime. Following this interview, Abby Langford, who was Michael's sister, began accusing the Broaduss family and the Westfield police of harassing their family. But Derek and Maria completely ignored this claim and instead hired a lawyer to meet with the Langford family and discuss why they were suspicious of them. And as you could imagine, the meeting did not go well, with the Langfords once again claiming Michael was innocent, and this was another method of harassment by the Broadusses. And this is basically where the case sat for the next handful of months, because in December 2014, the investigation had completely stalled, and the Westfield police told Derek and Maria that they were pretty much out of options. With them being no closer to figuring out who the Watcher was, the couple knew they couldn't move into the house and put themselves, and especially their children, in danger. So, in February 2015, they decided to sell the house. Obviously, the Broaduss' children were the biggest factors for this decision. But also, the stress of this entire situation had begun driving a wedge between Derek and Maria. They were unable to afford to pay for both their old home and 657 Boulevard, so the pair did eventually have to sell their old home, but since they weren't comfortable living at 657, they had to move in with Maria's parents. In a later interview, Derek would claim that this was one of the biggest indignities of his entire life. Following this move into her parents' house, both him and Maria fell into severe depression, and the pair began fighting almost constantly. Maria had begun seeing a therapist who would later tell her that she was most likely suffering from PTSD due to the letters. So, when the house was initially put for sale, the pair listed it for nearly $1.5 million to compensate for the cost of the renovations they had made. However, by the time the Broadusses put 657 up for sale, Many rumors were already swirling in Westfield about why the house had remained empty for over half a year. And even though the family shared the letters with very few people, multiple potential buyers either backed out of their offers or offered well below the asking price due to rumors about threatening letters. So, in mid March 2015, the house was lowered to $1.39 million. And 2 months later, in May 2015, the house was lowered again, this time to $1.25 million. By this point, Derek and Maria just wanted to be done with 657 Boulevard, and this price pretty well reflects that. However, they were not fully prepared to take the massive financial hit that came with listing it for that price. So, on June 2nd, 2015, the Broadusses filed a legal complaint against the Woodses. In their complaint, the Broadusses claimed that the Woodses had breached their sales contract and committed fraud by failing to disclose the Watcher letter they had received. As part of the lawsuit, the Broadusses sought a full refund of the $1.3 million purchase price, along with reimbursement for renovations, estimated to be within the hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the suit was filed, Derek and Maria hoped that a quiet settlement would be reached very quickly. And this was mostly due to the fact that at the time when they filed the suit, their children were still unaware of the Watcher letters, and their attorney pretty well assured them that the case would likely remain under the media's radar. Fast forward a few weeks, and the Watcher letters are making national headlines. Because in the documents for the civil suit, there were multiple snippets of the Watcher letters, and immediately, people were hooked. Now, when local media first began reporting on the Watcher letters, the Broadus's lawyer attempted to seal the court documents, but by the point he tried to do that, it was already too late. And before too long, news outlets like the Daily Mail, NBC, and the New York Post got hold of the documents, and the story immediately went viral. Soon, news trucks began camping outside the house, and Derek and Maria were constantly hounded by the media for comments about the case. This eventually led the Broadusses to leave Westfield to stay with a family friend while just waiting for the media frenzy to die down. After they left, Derek and Maria finally shared the letters with their children and explained what had been happening over the past year. But their children being clued in on what is happening wasn't the only big development happening, because as soon as Derek and Maria fled and all this sort of became local news, the people of Westfield began to question whether the Watcher story had actually been a hoax. This idea seems to have appeared after a town council meeting hosted by the at the time mayor of Westfield, Andy Stubitsky. This meeting was the first one held in Westfield following the letters going public, and was meant to sort of assure the public that there was nothing to fear. To do this, Mayor Stubitsky explained that it had been over a year since the last letter, and the Westfield police had performed an exhaustive investigation. But this statement left many Westfield residents sort of scratching their heads, because besides a few people, no one had been interviewed by police. So, for many, the next logical theory is that the Broadusses were committing some kind of scam or fraud. Soon, all kinds of theories began popping up against the Broadusses. These ranged from buyer's remorse and insurance fraud to theories that the Broadusses had made up the story to make the premise into a movie. Also, people began looking into the family's previous homes and discovered that over the course of 10 years, the family had upgraded from a $300,000 home to the $1.3 million home on 657 Boulevard. And despite the fact that he was the senior vice president of an insurance company in Manhattan, many believe Derek couldn't have afforded the new home in any sort of legitimate way. Just to show how suspicious some were of this family, following that town council meeting, an article was published in a local newspaper where residents of Westfield could anonymously give their opinion about the Watcher case, but most of these submissions would end up accusing the family of being con artists and hoaxers. And the Broadusses, who were still at their friend's house, could do nothing but take the abuse because they were instructed by the police not to say anything to anyone. Also, it wasn't just Westfield they had to contend with. Remember, this story was now red hot in the media and online. So people all over the country had their own thoughts and feelings and were quick to post them online for everyone to see. Places like Twitter or Facebook, Reddit were full of discussions, most of which became very critical of Derek and Maria. As for Derek and Maria, they were taking this probably about as well as you would expect. Within a year of buying what was supposed to be their dream home, their entire lives had been uprooted by essentially one person. And what's worse is that within that year of all this happening, they were no closer to discovering who the Watcher was. By January 2016, Derek and Maria were still pursuing their legal case against the Woods. Later that month, the Woodses filed a counterclaim against the Broadusses for defamation and damages. Now, when both of these lawsuits were eventually brought before a judge, they were very quickly dismissed. In the case of Broaduss v. Woods, the case was thrown out because the letter the Woodses had received was deemed non-threatening, and they had not intentionally concealed it during the sale. In the case of Woods v. Broaduss, the case was dismissed because the Broaduss family had never accused the Woods of writing the letter, and the original lawsuit did not result in any sort of measurable harm to the Woodses. Now, with all these legal issues happening in the background, Derek and Maria were still trying to figure out what to do with 657 Boulevard. In March 2016, the house was put back up for sale at the previous $1.25 million price. Later that month, the Broadusses purchased another home in Westfield through an LLC to keep its location private. 5 months later, in September 2016, 657 Boulevard was still on sale, and in that time, multiple buyers had put offers forward for the house, but once those buyers read the letters, they immediately backed out. Feeling once again out of options, the Broadusses submitted an application to the Westfield Planning Board to sell the property to a developer. Their proposal for the developer was to demolish the house of 657 Boulevard and replace it with 2 smaller homes. Now, when this plan became public, many in Westfield once again turned on the family, reigniting accusations that they were con artists and hoaxers. Public opinion against this family had shifted so drastically that anyone who tried to defend them on like Facebook or Reddit or any of those also risked being harassed or would get accused of being part of the hoax. And again, if you need any more proof of how little the people of Westfield seem to care about the Broaduss family, look no further than the actual planning board meeting for the house. In January 2017, so 4 months after that application was filed, the Westfield Planning Board held a 4-hour meeting to discuss the proposal. Throughout the entire meeting, the main concern raised by pretty much everybody was that these 2 new houses would be aesthetically unappealing. The Watcher or the Watcher letters were mentioned only once in this entire meeting, and that was near the end of the meeting. Beyond the aesthetic, the board, which is made up of Westfield residents, also expressed skepticism about how much the Broadusses stood to gain financially if the plan were approved. Which, by the way, the Broadusses wouldn't have made any profit from this plan. They had owned this house for 2.5 years without being able to live in it. But since they were technically the owners of the house, they were still responsible for the property taxes, the lawn care, and all the upkeep required to, meet like HOA standards. They had to still take care of this house. So no matter what this family did, they were going to lose money on this house. And despite all of that, the planning board did reject the Broadusses' application, much to Derek and Maria's dismay. Because when they submitted this proposal, they did believe it would be approved. They understood that some residents would be upset about tearing down a historic home, but they were pretty confident that the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the Watcher would be taken into account. After the denial, Maria, who had, for the most part, tried to remain hopeful and give the people of Westfield the benefit of the doubt, she finally came to a painful realization, which was that her neighbors seemed to care more about preserving this one house than protecting her family. However, in early February 2017, the Broadusses would finally get a reprieve when a family with grown children and 2 large dogs agreed to rent 657 Boulevard. This family was aware of the letters and claimed they weren't afraid of the Watcher, but as a precaution, the renter did include a clause in his lease agreement that would allow him to back out if any additional letters were to arrive. Now, even with those new tenants, the Broadusses were still losing money on 657 Boulevard, but this would at least lessen the continuous hemorrhaging they'd experienced over the last couple of years. 2 weeks after the new residents had moved in, they called Derek about some squirrels in the home's attic. So, Derek drove over, helped the family chase off the squirrels, and just as Derek was getting ready to leave, the patriarch of this family that's renting the home handed Derek an envelope that had arrived in the home's mailbox earlier that day. And as soon as Derek saw the envelope and the large blocky text adorning it, he knew exactly who it was from. The vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife from Maria. You wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of these so-called neighbors who has no idea who the Watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. Clearly, by the 4th letter, the Watcher had become vengeful and spiteful and had dropped any of their previously deemed sophisticated writing style. This anger seemed to stem from the negative attention the Broadusses had brought to 657 and the Watcher. I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. I watched as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me. Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. As the letter continues, the Watcher once again alludes to having co-conspirators throughout Westfield. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher. Then, to close their final letter, the Watcher makes their most direct threat thus far. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. You are despised by the house, and the Watcher won. This letter completely blindsided Derek and Maria. By this point, it had been nearly 2.5 years since they had heard anything from the Watcher. Then, when they were finally able to rent the home out and just do something with the house, the Watcher decided to strike again. As for the tenants of the home, they were shaken by the letter, but not enough for them to back out of the lease, which was a huge relief for Derek and Maria. And for the first time, Derek and Maria didn't view one of the Watcher's letters as entirely negative. To them, this now meant there was new evidence and a renewed investigation. Also, it's worth noting that throughout the long gap between the 3rd and 4th letter, they had continued their own investigation, working with private investigators and Westfield detectives. During that time, several new details emerged that hinted at the Watcher's possible identity. First, Michael Langford was once again completely cleared by the Westfield police, and that was much to Derek and Maria's frustration. Second, a detective on the case revealed that investigators had conducted DNA testing on one of the letters and determined that the DNA that they pulled off of the letter belonged to a woman. Multiple women in Westfield, including Abby Langford, Andrea Woods, and even Maria Broaduss herself, were tested, but all results came back negative. And unfortunately, the fourth letter didn't reveal any new information either. Ultimately, the most anyone could say was now that the Watcher was likely a well-read older woman. But for Derek and Maria, the Watcher still felt like someone who could be anywhere and anyone. After that, the case went cold once again until December 2018, when it was handed over to the Union County Prosecutor's Office, which they decided to restart the investigation from scratch. As part of that renewed investigation, the prosecutor's office reviewed the full history of 657 Boulevard to determine if any previous owners might have been involved. What they discovered is that the house was built in 1905 by a real estate agent named Harry Russell. In 1914, Harry Russell sold the house to William H. Davies for $1. Davies would go on to be a one-term mayor of Westfield during his stay in the house. In 1947, following Davies' death, the house was passed down to his son and daughter-in-law. They would sell the house to Dillard and Mary Bird in 1951, once again for $1. Then, over the next 40 years, the house would change hands 3 different times. The Bird family sold the house to Lawrence and Mary Schaefer for an estimated $23,000. The Schaefers then sold the home to Seth and Floyd Bakes for an unknown amount, and then the Bakes sold the house to John and Andrea Woods in 1990 for $370,000. And as we know, the Woods would live in the house until 2014, when they sold the house to the Broaduss family for $1.3 million. But looking back at 657's history didn't reveal any new information as far as the investigators were concerned. And despite that renewed effort by the prosecutor's office, no new information came to light about the Watcher. There was hope to uncover new information related to an incident from the previous year in December 2017, because just days before Christmas, several Westfield families, specifically those who had been most critical of the Broadusses, received anonymous, hand-delivered letters addressed to friends of the Broaduss family. The letters were scornful and angry, and were clearly intended to pass judgment on those who had mocked or harassed the family during their ordeal. However, the writing style didn't match that of the Watcher, and during the renewed investigation, Derek admitted that he had written these particular letters himself. When that information came out, that Derek had wrote those letters, it once again cast a shadow of a doubt on the Broadusses. And add in the fact that on December 5th, 2018, Netflix won a bidding war for the rights to produce a movie on the story in a reported 7-figure deal. Many felt confident that this was the payoff the Broadusses had been looking for since the beginning. However, in a minute, we'll talk about what this deal actually meant for the family. As for the house, the tenants who were renting 657 Boulevard moved out in mid-2019, and then finally, on July 1st, 2019, the Broadusses sold the house. A very private couple named Andrew and Allison Carr purchased the home for $959,000, which meant a $400,000 loss just in the price of the home for the Broadusses. Given the threatening tone of the Watcher letters, the Broadusses actually were required to disclose them, but it seems the Carrs had no fear of the Watcher returning. As of 2025, the Carrs still live at 657 Boulevard, and the Broadusses still reside in their privately purchased home in Westfield. In 2022, Netflix released its miniseries, The Watcher, inspired by the Broaduss family's experience. However, aside from the basic premise, the show seemed to have very little in common with the real-life events. And most likely, this was due to the fact that the Broaduss family wanted little to no involvement in the show. And actually, initially, they had no interest in selling their story to a studio. But they did eventually agree, because they did view it as a way to possibly recover some of their financial losses. So after Netflix secured the rights, the Broadusses remained pretty hands-off for the entire thing. And as far as anyone knows, they only made 2 specific requests for the show. So first, that they could not use the family's real names. And second, that the on-screen family should not look like them at all. Following the release of the show, internet forums and discussions were full of rumors that the Broadusses had been paid somewhere around $10 million for the show. But according to a later statement by Derek, the share the family made was still not enough to recoup what they had lost on the house. Also, Derek would later say that his family has not watched the show and has no intention of doing so. As for The Watcher, the Carr family has reported that they have received no additional letters from The Watcher since moving into the house. However, during their first year there, the Westfield police were called out there 3 times due to a triggering of the home's burglary alarm. On all 3 occasions, the alarm had been tripped in the basement, but police searches during those 3 alarms found nothing amiss. But after those 3 incidents, the property pretty much remained quiet until the release of the Netflix show. Following the show's debut, the Carrs have contacted the Westfield police over 50 times, and that's according to a New York Post article. But none of those 50 calls were related to The Watcher. They were all due to fans of the show and curious onlookers hoping to see the house and, encroaching on the Carr's property. According to the Westfield police, the investigation into the identity of the Watcher has once again stalled, but they emphasize that the case is not closed. Based on the DNA evidence collected from the letters, investigators still believe that the most likely suspect is an older woman living somewhere close to 657 Boulevard. To this day, the Broadusses continue to feel traumatized by their experience, and apart from a few interviews, have tried to just move on with their lives as best as they can. And that is where we are today. As I said, the case is still ongoing, so maybe one day, if another letter arrives or more evidence comes forward, I can provide an update. As for my theories about the possible identity of the Watcher, I don't really have a strong feeling about any particular individual. But I do want to emphasize that I do not believe the Broadusses are responsible for the letters. Their lives were practically ruined for years because of these letters. They lost their money, and the stress nearly caused Derek and Maria to separate. Additionally, they faced hostility from nearly the entire town of Westfield, and dealt with online harassment from people who didn't even know them. All for what? They lost hundreds of thousands of dollars and had to go into hiding. It just doesn't make sense that Derek and Maria would uproot their lives along with their children's. And in that point of uprooting their children's lives too, Derek, in one of those later interviews he did, mentioned that both students and faculty at the schools their children attended would make comments to them, calling their parents scammers and discussing how great Westfield was before they arrived. The crime itself is vague enough that, much like Derek and Maria, you can see the Watcher in anyone or no one simultaneously. And what makes this case truly haunting is that this could have happened to anyone. It could have happened to me, or it could have happened to any of you watching this video. Imagine just living in fear of your home, your neighborhood, and just everybody you meet. Imagine receiving these letters, reading these threats, and never being able to find out who was behind them. And while you sit there and imagine that, I want you all to remember that for this family, for the Broaduss family, this was real. And it all happened after purchasing their dream home on 657 Boulevard. Whew. Thank you all so much for watching and for the continued support on the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, all I ask is that you hit that like button and please consider subscribing, because both those things help me out and tell me that you all enjoy what I'm doing here. As for future videos, the next thing I post should be the second and final part of the Cecil Hotel. After that, though, I'm not really sure. My plan for now and for going forward is to alternate videos between big topics like the Cecil Hotel and smaller topics like this episode. Also, I forgot to mention this in my last video, but I've finally dusted off my second channel, and I'm hopefully going to start posting some more content over there soon. For now, that channel is mostly just going to be for gaming content, because that is something that I've always wanted to do as well. So far over there, I've only posted one video, but like I said, hopefully I'll have more over there soon. If that at all sounds interesting to you, I will put a link down in the description for my second channel. In other news related to the content on this channel, you can now find audio-only versions of my videos in podcast form on Spotify under the name Cryptic Cast, which has an image of my little pumpkin dude with a green background. For now, the podcast is only on Spotify because I so far am not smart enough to figure out how to post it elsewhere. But if I do figure out, I will be sure to let you all know. As of right now, the podcast is only meant to serve as an audio-only version of my videos. But in the future, I might consider doing some exclusive content for the podcast or for the YouTube channel. But like I said, anything like that is way down the line. As for the podcast, if that sounds interesting to you, you can also find a link to it in the description of this video if you're interested. But with all of that said, I want to say thank you to all of you once again for watching. And as always, I hope to see you again very soon.